Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Empathy at the Table. In this episode, we explore the transformative power of using empathy and vulnerability as a strength in leadership with seasoned HR professional Kim Purnell. Kim has mastered the art of nurturing talent and fostering inclusive cultures, shifting from a "I want it all" to a "we can both have it all" philosophy. Today, we delve into how embracing our strengths and sensitivities can actually be our greatest assets in a negotiation, the role of curiosity and continuous learning, and the impact of empathy in the workplace. Get ready for a thought-provoking conversation that challenges the status quo and redefines leadership. Welcome to Empathy at the Table. Hello, Kim Purnell. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you, Tony?
Very good, very good. Let's shoot straight off. And why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell them a little bit about who you are, your experience, and what your interests are in this topic of emotionally intelligent negotiation.
How much time do I have? I'm just kidding.
Take your time.
Kim Purnell, I am what I would call a people person with a capital P, right? I have been, oh my gosh, 25 plus years in corporate America. I started out on the service side of pension and health benefits, moved through the administration side, and then ultimately operations. I've had opportunity to be a small business owner, freelancer. I've done a lot, and in that time, I've noticed some things just through my own personal experiences that left me empty and curious about a lot, as it relates to culture, as it relates to leadership, as it relates to how to inspire workers to feel like they belong where they work, right? And so I started this journey after I moved into operations within pension and health benefits. I hit a wall. I know that I was moving further and further away from the people that I serve as I moved through management, and it left me curious about a lot, based on my own personal experience as well. So now I'm in this space where I'm building cultures. Startups are a sweet spot for me, but I've done, Fortune 500 and everything in between. And so I'm in this space today where, especially this topic of empathy at the table, I, I'm I just want to have this dialogue about how to be better stewards, all of us, leadership, employees, et cetera. So I'm excited to dive into this conversation today and really just, I think, have some aha moments.
Thank you so much. So let's pick some of the meat off this bone. You said you were curious as you went through corporate America. You became curious. I read into that code for you saw some things that you disagreed with.
I
Would you like to maybe highlight some of the things that you saw going through corporate America where you suddenly started to think, well, wait a minute, this isn't quite as I read in the brochure.
Yeah, yeah. So after I graduated high school, I had no intention of going to college, none. Um, I became a single mom early and knew that education was my pathway, right? So I was very intentional about how I was going to obtain my degree. So I went to a private business college. So you get all of the infrastructure of what to do and what not to do, right? How to dress, how to speak, how to look. And I showed up like that in corporate America. Early on, it was an amazing experience, right? Because I was trying to find my place. But what I found was that I was not invited to a lot of the places that I found myself in. And I started doing this.
Mm,
Well, what's wrong with me? What did I miss? How do I make myself better? Right. And I did that for like 15 years. Go harder, do better, take more, just, you know what I mean?
mm,
Um, with it was like the target was moving all of the time. So I got to a place where I was like, yes, I'm in human resources now, right? I'm a program manager. I'm shaping minds and careers, and I didn't get that same energy from a lot of my peers, right? Caveat, I was a minority in a lot of the spaces, especially in HR. And so I found myself looking to the left and the right, like, okay, what do I need to do now to be better? What do I need to do now to prove myself?
Mm.
And I distinctly remember having a performance management conversation with my manager. And she was white. And she basically told me, you're great, right? But we have a structure here of who can get exceeds, how many percentages can get exceeds, how many percent, right? So you're great, keep doing the great work, but I just can't give you an exceeds rating. And it's like you're telling me that I'm doing all of these things above and beyond. So I felt like I was in a box and I needed to get out of the
Mm.
box, right? So I started learning more about Kim, right? Because that's the only thing I have control over at that point, I felt, right? Um, being intentional about how I show up, right? Because if I'm being very transparent, authenticity was not accepted in corporate America. You know, there was a motto of drop your stuff at the door when you get here and you can pick it up when you leave. And that bothered me. I spend 70% of my time here, pretty
Mm.
much,
Mm.
because then I was recruiting. So I'm doing road shows and everything. I just wanted more for myself. And then that grew into wanting more for the people around me,
Mm.
regardless to what level they're at,
Mm.
right? So I started um, a healing journey that incorporated learning about mental health first aid, right? Learning about trauma informed care, right? Because it amazes me how a lot of leaders think that you can bifurcate yourself when you come to work.
Mm.
That's not a
Mm.
realistic expectation. And so I'm just over the last 5 years, 10 years, have really been focused on how do we take this big DEI thing and make it realistic? DEI is not an initiative, it's a framework. It's how you think about the people that you employ and that you work with, right? And so just digging more into that. And what's ironic is empathy was kind of, as I look at the landscape of my career, was way off in the distance when I started. And as I matriculate through my career, empathy is becoming closer and closer into the forefront.
Mm.
Um, I'm reading, I'm researching, and a staggering stat, right? When you think about mental health in America, 47% of Americans are suffering in some way with some kind of mental issue. You cannot drop that off at the door when
Mm.
you walk into work.
Yeah.
So it's just this for me. Um, I desire to be a catalyst for companies and individuals to learn about the importance of empathy. Empathy to me is confusing. A lot of times people confuse empathy and sympathy,
Mm. Mm.
right? I used to think when I was younger, sympathy was this powerful emotion. Sympathy is merely me saying, I feel sorry for you. Empathy, however, is an activator emotion because I'm not just looking at you saying, oh, I feel sorry. I'm putting myself in your shoes. I'm allowing myself to experience what you experience. That activates change, thought, behavior, right? And so this is like consuming me these days
Mm.
in terms
I,
of empathy, especially in leadership.
So I've really, as you know, over the years, I've really done some deep dives, deep research, had several conversations, many conversations. It's for me, it's an anvil that's worn out many hammers. This idea of empathy, and in some areas, it's almost a swear word. People are like, no, 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 we don't deal with empathy here. That's kind of namby pamby kind of supplicative stuff,
It's
and
soft,
it's
right?
soft, right? But you and I both know that for to show real empathy doesn't mean you're being soft, right? Real empathy, some of the toughest conversations I've ever had in my life have been because I've shown empathy. And I've been able to say some really difficult things and had difficult things said to me. But when the person says it with empathy, then there's a level of acceptance, right? Um, my thing is, I want to be able to, through emotionally intelligent negotiation, I want to be able to give people the frameworks and the skill sets to be able to feel confident about having these challenging conversations, right? To give them the tools to be able to do so and not feel afraid. Um, One thing that really, when you and I first spoke, this has stuck with me, and you said this to me like a year ago, and I still remember it. And it was around the time of the quiet quitting when that was starting to
Yeah.
happen.
Yes.
And after your 25 years of being in the HR world, you said to me that you were finally hearing people saying, I'm not the only one, right? As people were quitting, this was how they were finally being able to stand up and say, you know what? I'm not quitting because I can't stand the job. I'm quitting for my own mental health, right? So, how has that moved forward? How has that narrative now, a year later, how have you noticed it's moved forward in the way people are now having these type of conversations?
That's a great question. And if you could give me a little latitude, um,
Go for it.
recent events say yes, there's movement on that dial. And at the same time, like, no, right?
Mm,
And I think I shared this article with you earlier this week about the unfortunate passing of Dr. Bonnie Bailey,
mm,
um, faculty at an HBCU here in America that took her own life due
mm,
to what she's claiming as bullying, harassment from her superiors. Um, that hit me hard,
mm,
hit me so hard for a number of reasons. But the biggest one is that this woman dedicated her life to helping others, listening to others, being a catalyst for change. And she finally achieves what she thinks is, yes, this was my goal. I want to teach at an HBCU. And within 9 months, she succumbed to pressures, if you
mm,
will,
mm,
right, from a leader. On the other hand, and kind of steeped in a little controversy, Dr. Gay, the former president of Harvard, resigned, right? And so I look at that like split dichotomy of, while one person that's experiencing negative experiences in the workplace, depending on your background and where you come from and what you're made of, you feel like you have to stick it out for whatever reason, personal,
mm,
financial.
mm,
So, like in Dr. Bailey's case, she had worked her whole life to get here and she was trying to fight to keep it.
mm,
Um, there's just such an intensity around humanity, just humanity,
mm,
right? Like, strip away the business part, just treating people with kindness. And I would argue curiosity, because curiosity is the catalyst to change, right? If
mm,
I'm curious about something, I'm going to go look at it, learn it, hopefully adopt some changes, right? Um, but it's hard to say whether things are getting better or not.
Mm,
There's a lot going on in the world that's impacting employees. Um, but it's really hard to say. It's like we take two steps forward and a step
mm.
back, and we do this dance, right? Um, but I'm just going to continue to fight the good fight.
Well, I mean, I read this article, which I love the other day, where the gentleman was saying sometimes when you switch on the news and you hear bad news or you're surrounded by bad news, you shouldn't switch it off and think that the world is a bad place. What that should do is motivate you to make some changes in
So,
and around your life, right? So go and skill up or help people with the skill set that you have. And
absolutely.
if you begin that like that and you use what you're seeing that you can't control, right? The narrative you cannot control, but if you use that as a motivator to motivate your actions to do things that you can control, then that's how we start to make those changes.
Absolutely.
So I'm kind of going back to corporate America, and I'm wondering where do you see the changes or the potential changes happening? Would it be from the top down, or is it from the bottom up, or is it just a lateral spread? Where do we start this movement?
I love this question, Tony. Because one of the things that I thought about in preparation for this conversation was at the table.
Hmm.
And what does that mean really? Like when I think about it, generally speaking, it's like this hierarchical achievement, right? I have arrived. But I contend that the table is much grander than that. The table should not be just the decision makers, right? The leadership table. What about
Hmm.
the community table?
Hmm.
That's where the magic happens,
Hmm.
right? I see a community table where everyone at every level has an opportunity to contribute to the makings of our company, right? The top down funnel only works in certain situations, urgent, important, regulatory, right? Like
Right.
someone
Right.
needs to make the decision. But when we're talking about creating psychological safety,
Hmm.
creating spaces of equity and inclusion and belonging, it has to be a community table.
Hmm. Hmm.
It has to be.
I really like that. And actually, Kim, when I first launched this empathy at the table, I was thinking around that, and that was my idea was, well, who should be at that table, right?
Yeah,
When you imagine that table, and it's a table where you're going to have a really difficult conversation, whether it be around diversity and inclusion, whether it be around sexism, racism, uh, um, uh, whichever kind of ism you want to mention, who should be at that table? And when you're at that table, how can you maintain and make sure that the conversation is one where we are genuinely curious about the other people at the table, what their reasons are for showing up, and let's just have a great conversation, right? As tough and challenging as it might be, it's not something to run away from. And so
exactly.
I'm encouraged to hear people like you are still advocating for this. Um, but also what I'm hearing is that in the circles where you are right now, it seems that you're in almost like a liminal space, right? In between, well, is it
Absolutely.
changing? Is it not changing? Well, we don't really know whether it's changing, but we're going to do this anyway, right? Is that close to what you're experiencing?
Absolutely. Because if I stop today,
Yeah,
I am guaranteed that nothing will change.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm that hopeful that I will grab a starfish one at a time and
yeah,
throw them back into the ocean.
yeah, yeah,
Because at least that one is no longer in peril, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I like that.
Just understanding what is within my reach,
Mm. And
right?
also share with me this concept. Um, at the table, there are people who have roles at the table. What's often forgotten, I think, is the responsibilities that they have that attach to those roles. Can you
Absolutely.
expand on that thought for us?
Absolutely. So when I think about the table and the responsibility of that, right? There being at the table is binary.
Mm,
You're not there just to do that one COO, CEO, EIO, right?
mm,
You're supposed to be multifaceted and being able to not only help to set strategy, but also learn, right? There's a big bad word at the leadership level, and that's vulnerability.
yes. Yeah.
Who wants to demonstrate that, right? Because there's this idea that in order to be a great leader, I have to be commanding and decisive, and right,
Mm,
we don't have all of the answers. And I'm so much more attracted to a leader that says, you know what, I don't know, but I can find out.
that's right. Yeah.
Or, I don't know how that'll turn out. Let's test it, right?
Mm,
Some bravery, some vulnerability, right? Some
mm,
empathy, right? To be able to connect, put yourself in other people's shoes to give you a different lens,
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
and then act. Test, fail, test again, right? But there's a fear factor involved that is limiting at a leadership level. And I get it, right? There are a lot of dynamics going on,
Mm,
not only in corporate America, but the world at large. And people are ducking and trying to, stay in their lane.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it becomes hard when you get laser focused like that, right? Because there's still other things going on in the world and in your world, in your
Yeah.
sphere,
Yeah.
that demands you to multitask, right? But
Mm,
understanding that you are not, as a leader, you're fluid. You should be.
mm,
You should be. There are three C's for me when I think about leadership that are pivotal. Um, and I think it's kind of foundational for me. The first C is curiosity. Curiosity to me, again, is catalyst for change. Curiosity, courage,
mhm.
continuous listening and learning, right? Those three things are agitators to make things happen. And so I think,
Agitators to make
yeah,
things happen. I love that. I love it.
and leadership at the table.
Oh, yeah. Agitators. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, have you seen that movie, The Best of Enemies?
No.
Now, everything you're explaining is in this movie. I saw it the other day. It's quite long. It's a 2-hour movie, and it's a true story or based on a true story about a school. I don't know where in the States, but it was a school which was um, in a town where it was very racially divided, and it was back in the 70s. And the black school burnt down, and so you had, like, I don't know, 180 kids who needed to go to school, but they couldn't go to school in their school building because it got burnt down. So they had to go to the local white school. And of course, the white people in the town were all up in arms and they didn't want it. And there was a leader who was from the KKK, and he was up in arms and saying, "There's no way this is going to happen." And there was a black activist. Her name was Anne Atwell, I think, and she was like dead against it. And so they brought in an outsider and to hold what they call a charrette, which is a
Okay.
conversation between the two parties that disagreed with each other. And what was fascinating was obviously the warring factions didn't want to speak. It was a tough conversation, it was a challenging conversation, and the issues are very, very emotive. And so, of course, they didn't want to talk. But what happened was the outsider that they brought in to have this charrette, he said, "We're going to bring some representatives from both sides to sit down and we need to talk about these issues. This talk is going to happen anyway, so we want you to show up." And the KKK guy said, "There's no way I'm going to be there. I don't want to talk to this woman. I don't want to talk to these people." And the man said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, I represent my people, and for that reason, I'm not going to be there." And the man said, this talk is going on anyway. How will you represent your people if you're not there?
Mhm. Yeah.
So he had to show up. And slowly but surely, as they had these difficult, challenging conversations, a lot of their fears, a lot of their prejudices, all of them became, they laid on both sides, right? They became obvious and they were laid out to bear on the table. And as they did so, they actually began to realize that actually they had much more in common than they had
Yes.
apart. And it's a
Yes.
true story. And as I said, you can look it up. They call it a charrette, and it's called The Best of Enemies.
Okay.
And I mention this because I think, you know, how could we bring that level of authenticity, raw, and often kind of incendiary and dangerous kind of conversation into the workplace to allow people to have these kind of conversations, and then move on to better, bigger, greener pastures? Do you see a world where that's going to happen?
I'm fighting for a world where that happens.
Hmm.
And what I think is part of the solution is a more intentional, targeted experience for leaders, right? In the way of training, but it's more experiential, right? So instead of saying, hey, C suite, we're going to make you take implicit bias training,
Hmm.
right? Instead of that, it's a workshop of sorts, right? And there's pre work involved to allow people to practice being vulnerable.
Hmm.
Because if that mechanism isn't unlocked, the vulnerability mechanism at the leadership table, it will be hard to identify with people in
Hmm.
your workplace. It'll be
Hmm.
hard for them to identify with you also, right? Um, but some sort of experiential training or skill building that allows leaders to practice acting like vulnerable people. Like, you know what? You're the CEO, you're credentialed, no one's questioning that here. We just want all of you here as a
Hmm.
leader.
Hmm.
Who's inviting the leaders to bring their whole selves to work? I actually had a conversation not long ago with a C-suite female executive, and she said to me, authenticity is great and vulnerability is great, but I just don't know how much of it I can bring to work. Right. Well,
Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
responsible for setting the stage for that? As a senior leader, as an executive on this team, you should know clearly how much of you can bring here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if there's a part of you that's not invited, then you need to be curious enough to have conversations about why.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I want to make it quite clear because sometimes people get confused. I know we've mentioned it again, but I want to be really clear that, yeah, this conversation about empathy, vulnerability, these are not swear words. These are power words. And what we're not advocating that people come to work crying and sharing their problems with everybody. We're not advocating that. What we're advocating is a strong, tough approach to how you have these conversations, to be able to stand in a conversation where somebody is saying something that you don't like, that you completely disagree with, but still remain present and remain in the conversation and remain curious about the other person's motives.
Absolutely.
Irrespective of what's going on with them, you just hold that space. And I think that's a distinction, that we're, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, so that's not my kind of area. Where I am really keen on impressing upon people is when you're having these conversations, hold that space. Feel confident that if somebody is showing an emotion in front of you, that's a data point of information. and you should take it as such and not shut it down.
Yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Mm.
I think, you know, um, empathy and sensitive
Yeah,
have been synonymous
yeah, yeah.
for a long time, right? And I'm coming to a place in my life where I'm embracing that. To
Mm.
me, that is a positive characteristic.
Right, right.
I'm sensitive to people. That's part of humanity, right? And really being, I love you kind of reiterating that empathy is not a bad word.
Right, right.
Not. It is a strength. Empathy is an activator emotion. It
Yeah.
is.
So how do you keep your head screwed on and pointing in the right direction in this sea of corporate America going one way or the other in the storm? How do you remain calm in the eye of the storm?
Um, I'm a woman of faith.
Mm.
I know that everything happens for a reason. And I'm in the second half of my life now. Um, so instead of, and I think we talked about this last year, I've kind of pivoted my position, my posture, and instead of asking to a situation or a person, what happened? What, what's wrong with you?
Mm.
Now I ask, what happened? Right? That
Mm.
curiosity of if someone is presenting in a way that's jarring or offensive, like, okay, our first thing is to say, okay, they're broken.
Right, right,
Right. Instead of what happened? And how do we kind of move past what your triggers are
right.
in order to get to conversation, negotiation, right?
Mm.
Uh, but I nurture myself now.
Mm.
Practice being present in the moments now.
Mm.
Intentional about my mental health now. And I've taken what I would consider triggers from previous experiences to change them to catalysts, right? So where before that agitator would have triggered me, if I have an emotional reaction, I stop and process and pivot, right? So my history, my past is
Mm.
not foregone. I'm still benefiting from that today, but I flipped it so that now it's benefiting me.
That's so great. That's emotional intelligence. That's the ability to be able to tap into what you're feeling and channel it in a positive way, right? In a resourceful way.
Yeah.
And not look at the emotion and see it as something negative, but see it as something simply that you can channel in a much more resourceful way. I just wonder, um, how do you think that people in your sphere, in the work that you've been doing, how do you think that people would respond to this type of training, that kind of approach?
Definitely with resistance. I mean,
Mm,
we're
mm,
talking 50 to 100 years of corporate America
mm,
conditioning, right?
yeah.
And so vulnerability is just not comfortable, whether you're with people you know or not.
Mm,
It's not a
mm,
comfortable place. Um, but you just have to keep doing the thing,
mm.
right? With grace.
You know,
That's the
a friend of mine who's he's a hostage negotiator. I quote him very often because he's one of the best negotiators I've ever met. Um, and he literally he wears this key ring and he can be called at any time and he might have to go off to Nicaragua and he might have to negotiate a hostage negotiation in the middle of the jungle. So he's always ready to negotiate. And one of the things he said to me was, he said, I always lead with empathy. I always lead with empathy. But behind that is a strength that I know that anything that happens, I can handle it. Whatever situation that comes up, I have the tools to be able to handle that. And that gives me that confidence. And so sometimes I think that it's because people aren't confident to have those conversations that they then display an almost immature approach to dealing with people who are potentially challenging. But what they're really saying is, I don't know how to handle this. I don't have
I
the
don't
skill set to
know.
handle this, right?
Right. Exactly.
Mm,
Exactly. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Um, but I think, empathy in leadership. I actually read an article today that was from 2021, and it was a SHRM article that was saying empathy in leadership is the most critical leadership skill.
right,
What's happened since 2021 to solidify that,
right, right,
right? You see these, I'm seeing these articles pop up, right? Little buzzes, but where is the body of work
right.
for
Yeah.
these conversations?
Mm,
And until we build that, it'll just be those articles or one-off conversations that are being had, but no collective body agreeing that this is our focus, and these are the things that we want to elicit change in.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, Kim, I think it's one of those things that you plant the seed. It's you nurture it as well as you can, um, but I feel that people like us are in the business of planting the seeds of trees under whose shade we will probably never sit.
yeah,
But it's
never.
got to be done anyway, right? I think that's the commitment that we have, which is about making a real impact, and seeing how far we can take it, and hopefully encourage the next generation to do likewise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here to that.
Would you finally, Kim, could you share with us how people can connect with you? I mean, you have such a wonderful, lovely, warm spirit. If this has resonated with anybody and somebody wants to connect with you, how can they connect with you? And what is it you're working on at the moment that people may be able to help you with?
Absolutely. So right now, I am formulating a way to offer support to leaders and companies and individuals, because I feel like there's something missing at the employee level from a consultative perspective outside of HR, right? That's missing. So I am working to create this consulting service around empathy, but more about humanity in the workplace, right? So of course I'm on LinkedIn, Kimberly Purnell. Anyone is free to email me at kimpurnell1, the number one, at comcast.net.
Super. Well, Kim, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation today. I've really, really enjoyed it, and I knew I would. I was been looking forward to this for a while. And our listeners will put in the show notes, we'll put Kim's details so you'll be able to connect with her. Make sure you do. And I'd love to follow more about your project as it develops.
Awesome. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much, Kim. Have a great day. Thank you for tuning in to our conversation with Kim Purnell, where we tackle the real substance of leadership, empathy, vulnerability, and the undeniable power of effective negotiation. Kim's insights cut through the noise, offering actionable strategies to elevate anyone ready to up their game in leadership. If this discussion has challenged your perspective or equipped you with new tools for your leadership arsenal, make sure that you hit follow or subscribe. Spread the word by sharing this episode with your network. Stay informed, stay engaged, and join us next time at Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor.